I have been a home renovation contractor in the state of Texas for nearly 35 years now. In that time, I have worked on some truly incredible homes and met some wonderful people. But I have also taken one or two jobs that have come to haunt my very soul. Back in March of 1994, I received a call regarding a dilapidated house near the Laredo Ranchettes. The owner explained that the foundations were failing and the entire framing needed to be shored up. It was a massive overhaul involving the roof, the windows, and the entire HVAC system. It was looking like a 6-month contract worth over $100,000. I signed the papers on Friday and drove out to the site first thing Monday morning. When I arrived, I found that the key the owner had given me simply would not turn in the lock. I tried calling the client, but since it was so early, I only got his voicemail. I decided to spend the time surveying the exterior of the building instead. Suddenly, a black SUV came tearing up the dirt road, stopping right behind my truck. A man dressed in a dark security uniform stepped out and demanded to know what I was doing. I explained that I was the contractor hired to renovate the property. He told me I couldn't be there because the safety inspectors hadn't finished their sweep. Everything looked legitimate, so I got back in my truck and headed back into town. Later that afternoon, the client called me back sounding incredibly frustrated. When I mentioned the security guard, the client went silent and said he hadn't hired anyone. He asked me to meet him at the house the next morning with a locksmith and a sheriff's deputy. We all arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, the atmosphere thick with unspoken dread. The locksmith made quick work of the deadbolt and the deputy led the way inside. I was immediately struck by how meticulously clean the hallway appeared to be. In one of the ground floor rooms, the deputy found a metal chair bolted firmly to the floor. A pile of heavy iron chains lay discarded in the corner, and the deputy immediately called for backup. Upstairs, we found the bathroom had been modified in a way that defied all logic. The shower cubicle had been reinforced with thick concrete slabs that were pockmarked with bullet holes. The deputy told us to leave immediately, declaring the entire house a crime scene. We walked back out into the Texas heat, but I felt a deep, bone-chilling cold. It was obvious that people had been hurt and killed within those 4 walls. The cleanliness of the room suggested they had been scrubbed down right after my first visit. I'll never forget the look on that deputy's face. He looked like he'd seen the devil himself. Renovations were delayed for months as the police combed every inch of the property. They dug up the entire yard until it looked like the surface of the moon, full of craters. When the job finally started again, the client told me the police found no forensic evidence at all. That meant that during my first visit, the killers were likely still inside, watching me. While I was fumbling with the wrong key, they were standing in the shadows, waiting. They might have even had their victims in there with them at that very moment. Thinking about how close I was to that level of evil makes my skin crawl to this day. It was a torture and execution chamber disguised as a simple renovation project. I finished the job, but I never felt comfortable stepping into that bathroom again. I spent over 2 decades serving as a Texas Ranger, witnessing things that follow a man to his final rest. Out of all the darkness I encountered, one specific case from the early 80s still creeps into my mind on lonely nights. Back then, I was a young understudy, working alongside a veteran ranger who possessed a lifetime of hard-earned wisdom. Our routine was interrupted when we were tasked to investigate the disappearance of a man named Billy Staton and his partner. Staton had last been seen heading to the home of Paul Wolf, the man now married to Staton's ex-wife. There was known friction between them, specifically regarding the custody of Staton's young daughter, Melody. Wolf had a history of becoming aggressive whenever Billy showed up to pick up his child. Anticipating trouble, Billy Staton had wisely slipped a small tape recorder into his pocket before his final visit. When we first questioned Wolf at his ranch, he looked us in the eye and claimed he hadn't seen Staton in a week. We knew immediately that he was lying, and that lie gave us all the grounds we needed to take him into custody. Once inside the sterile walls of the station, Wolf's demeanor shifted as he realized he was trapped. He suddenly remembered the visit but spun a tale of a violent confrontation initiated by Staten. He claimed Staten had become forceful with the child, prompting a fight that spiraled out of control. Wolf insisted he struck Staten with an iron bar in a blind panic to protect his family. He admitted to dumping the bodies of Staten and his fiancée Leticia Castro in a nearby river. We followed his directions and found the remains bloated and ravaged by the lukewarm water. Wolf had hoped the decomposition would hide the truth, but the autopsy revealed a fatal gunshot wound to Castro's head. This physical evidence shattered his iron bar story, but the true revelation was still hidden on Staten's body. The device was moldy and waterlogged, a state that seemed beyond any local repair. Following expert advice, we shipped the tape to the FBI lab in Washington in a jar of water to prevent further decay. Weeks passed in silence until a package arrived containing a restored, working copy of the recording. The audio was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable, and they began to play out a nightmare. We heard Staten attempting to console his crying daughter with a gentle, patient voice. There was no aggression from him. Instead, it was Wolf whose voice rose in a terrifying, unprovoked rage. A scuffle broke out, followed by a series of sickening, rhythmic thumps that echoed through the speaker. Then we heard the ex-wife's voice, not crying in fear, but shouting for Wolf to hurry up and get him. She screamed for him to hit Staten again, just as Castro realized the danger and tried to flee for her life. The recording captured the chilling moment. The door was blocked and her life was abruptly ended. The tape continued to roll as they discussed the cleanup, with Wolf complaining about the mess his accomplice made. That bloodstain became a crucial piece of physical evidence, surviving even their attempts at industrial cleaning. With the tape and the forensics, we saw Paul Wolf and his wife sentenced for their heinous crimes. I have seen hundreds of crime scenes, but usually we arrive long after the silence has set in. I have seen death in grainy black and white footage, like a silent movie from a different era. But that recording was different because it forced me to hear the very moment a soul was extinguished. The sound of Billy Staten's final guttural groan as his skull was crushed is a sound that never leaves you. It serves as a reminder of the raw, unedited evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary Texas doorways. Justice was served for Billy and Leticia, but the echoes of their tragedy remain embedded in the land. I often wonder if the work we did truly made a difference against the tide of such darkness. Because even as one case closes, another story of adrenaline and bad choices begins to unfold in the heat of the plains. I didn't know it then, but the cycle of violence was moving from the hands of desperate men to those who sought the thrill of the hunt. And for some, the rush of the crime is far more addictive than any drug or bottle of whiskey. Far across the state, a new shadow was rising, one that would lead to a collision with a man far more dangerous than Paul Wolf. This was only the beginning of a path that would lead deep into the heart of the cartel's territory. The ghosts of the dead have a way of following you, especially when the living are just as terrifying. But as the ranger's story ends, another man's journey into the abyss of organized crime is just about to take its first fatal step. My journey into the dark heart of Texas crime didn't begin with a plan, but with a craving for a feeling I couldn't find anywhere else. I was raised in a trailer park by a single mother who worked herself to the bone to give me the best life she could. People used to say my daddy was a wild man, and I suppose I was born with that same restless, bad seed in my blood. While other kids were getting hooked on drugs or booze, I found my poison in the electric rush of adrenaline. It all started when I finally stood up to my middle school bully and felt the impact of my fist against his face. I took a beating for it, but the feeling of that sweet right hook made me feel like I was walking on air. My real education in crime began when I decided to get revenge for my cousin after his toy cap gun was stolen at school. I didn't just get the toy back, I made that kid empty his pockets and take the very shirt off his back. That rush was a career decider for me, making me realize I could take whatever I wanted from the world. By the age of 16, I was already a veteran of stealing cars and breaking into houses to avoid a regular job. I started hanging out in the types of bars where you meet people who don't care about the law. That's where I met TJ, a man who knew how to turn a simple theft into an organized operation. We started by robbing long-haul truckers who were distracted by local sex workers at truck stops. We would wait for the cab to start shaking before we raided the cargo and made off with the goods. The money was good, but as the bills piled up, we knew we had to graduate to bigger targets. We moved on to hitting gas stations and pawn shops, specifically timing our strikes for deposit days. To handle the increasing scale of our heists, we brought in a guy named Jody to manage crowd control. This was my crew for 3 years, hitting a new location every couple of months whenever the conditions were perfect. But when Jody became unavailable for a credit union job, TJ claimed he had found the perfect replacement. He introduced me to a man named Vincent, and I insisted on a face-to-face meeting before letting him in. When Vincent walked through the door, he was the most intimidating human being I had ever laid eyes on. He carried himself with a quiet, lethal confidence that made me feel like a trapped animal just sitting across from him. Vincent claimed to have military experience in another country and connections to dangerous groups in New Mexico. Something about his story didn't sit right with me, but his physical presence was exactly what we needed for the job. We hit the small-town credit union a week later, but the manager proved to be much tougher than we anticipated. I had to bash the manager over the head several times just to show him I wasn't playing games. Despite the blood, the man refused to break, and I began to worry that the clock was running out on us. That's when Vincent stepped in, pointing at a young teller and suggesting she was the manager's daughter. Vincent began to describe the horrific things he would do to her right there in front of the man. The manager's resistance crumbled instantly, and he handed over the keys with tears streaming down his face. Later, when I asked if he was serious about his threats, Vincent simply replied that he'd do whatever it takes. On our next job near San Antonio, Vincent surprised us again by speaking fluent, soothing Spanish to a panicked supervisor. It worked perfectly, and she handed over the vault keys as if she were under a dark spell. After that job, Vincent disappeared for 9 months, and we were more than happy to see him go. He felt like a ticking time bomb, a liability that was eventually going to blow up in all our faces. But out of the blue, TJ got a call from Vincent about a score that was supposed to be the last one before we retired. I tried to roll my eyes, but the look on TJ's face told me that this wasn't just another small-town robbery. TJ warned me that if he told me the details now, I'd probably jump out of the moving car in terror. He promised that this one job would provide enough cash to let us never worry about anything ever again. We pulled up to a secluded diner to meet Vincent and hear the plan that would change our lives forever. As we sat down, Vincent leaned forward and revealed our target. We were going to rob the Sinaloa cartel. But as the word Sinaloa hung in the air like a death sentence, I realized that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The silence that followed Vincent's mention of the Sinaloa cartel felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. Vincent leaned forward, the light catching the predatory glint in his pupils. He unrolled a hand-drawn map on the table, its edges frayed and stained with coffee. This isn't a simple truck heist like the ones we've pulled in El Paso. Every month, a black SUV crosses the border at a specific unguarded point near the river. They carry the monthly collection from the distribution hubs in Houston and Dallas. We are talking about $5 million in unmarked bills sitting in the back of a single vehicle. My hands started to shake, so I tucked them under my thighs to hide the nerves. $5 million meant a life of luxury, but it also meant a target on our backs for eternity. Vincent explained that the courier travels with only 2 guards to avoid drawing attention. He had been tracking their schedule for 3 months, watching every fluctuation in their timing. The plan was to intercept them at a dry creek bed where the road narrows significantly. We would use a spike strip to blow the tires and then disable the engine with a well-placed shot. Vincent patted a long, black duffel bag resting on the chair beside him. I knew without asking that it was filled with high-caliber hardware we weren't supposed to have. Vincent looked me straight in the eye and asked if I was in or if I was a coward. I thought about my mounting debts and the dead-end life I was currently living. I nodded slowly, the movement feeling like I was tightening a noose around my own neck. A slow, cruel smile spread across Vincent's face as he pulled out a bottle of tequila. He poured 2 glasses, the clear liquid sloshing violently against the rims. We toasted to our future, though the liquid tasted like copper and ash in my mouth. The next 3 days were a blur of dry runs and tactical briefings. Vincent was a perfectionist, forcing us to repeat the ambush maneuvers until our muscles screamed. I couldn't sleep, convinced that every siren in the distance was coming for me. I noticed Vincent checking his phone constantly, his expression darkening with each message. He told me that our window of opportunity was shrinking because of internal cartel politics. The shipment had been moved up by 48 hours, catching us off guard. We were moving tonight, whether we felt ready or not. The drive to the border was silent, the only sound being the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I checked my weapon for the 10th time, my fingers fumbling with the safety switch. Vincent told me to keep my head down and not to fire unless he gave the signal. We arrived at the Arroyo 3 hours before the expected intercept time. We dug into the hillside, covering ourselves with camouflage netting and dry brush. The desert air was biting cold, and the sound of insects seemed deafening in the stillness. Every pair of headlights in the distance made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. Finally, the radio crackled with a single, sharp burst of static from our lookout. The target was 5 minutes out, traveling at high speed exactly as predicted. I could hear the distant roar of a powerful engine echoing off the canyon walls. Vincent pulled his mask down, his eyes becoming 2 cold points of light behind the fabric. Just as the black SUV rounded the corner, I noticed a second vehicle following closely behind it. This wasn't part of the plan. There was never supposed to be a chase car. Vincent didn't hesitate for a second and squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash blinding me. The lead SUV's tire disintegrated, sending the heavy vehicle into a violent sideways skid. As the dust began to settle, the doors of the second vehicle flew open and men with automatic weapons stepped out. I looked at Vincent, expecting a retreat, but he was already charging down the hill toward the carnage. The sound of gravel crunching under Vincent's boots echoed like gunfire in the silent Mexican valley. I stood frozen by our truck, watching the black smoke billow from the overturned courier vehicle. A high-pitched scream pierced the air, coming from the passenger side of the wreckage. Vincent didn't flinch as he raised his rifle, aiming it directly at the movement within the car. To our horror, a second vehicle rounded the bend, its headlights cutting through the rising dust. It wasn't the cartel backup we feared, but a family of locals caught in the crossfire. I shouted for Vincent to hold his fire, but the adrenaline had already taken hold of him. He turned the rifle toward the family's truck without a moment of hesitation. Muzzle flashes illuminated his face in brief, terrifying strobes of orange light. The windshield of the yellow truck shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds. I watched as the driver slumped over the steering wheel, the horn beginning a long, low wail. Vincent kept firing until the magazine clicked empty against the silence of the canyon. I ran toward him, grabbing his shoulder to spin him around and face me. His eyes were empty, reflecting nothing of the carnage he had just unleashed. "They were witnesses," he whispered, his voice devoid of any remorse or fear. The realization that I was now an accomplice to mass murder sank into my gut like lead. "We need to move the money and get out of here before the real cartel shows up," I hissed. Vincent ignored me, stepping over the bodies to reach the trunk of the courier car. Inside were 4 heavy duffel bags, stuffed to the zippers with vacuum-sealed bricks of cash. But the blood from the driver had leaked into the trunk, staining the edges of the currency. Vincent laughed, a dry, hacking sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. We began hauling the bags to our SUV, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Every snap of a twig in the brush sounded like a cartel hit squad closing in. The other 2 members of our crew stood by the SUV, their faces masked in total shock. They hadn't signed up for an execution, only a robbery. A rift was forming right there on that dirt road, a line drawn in the sand by blood. Vincent noticed the hesitation and slowly rested his hand on his holstered pistol. "Get in the car or stay here with the rest of the trash," he muttered. We piled into the SUV, the interior smelling of sweat, gunpowder, and iron. As we drove away, I looked back at the flickering flames consuming the evidence of our sins. The silence in the car was heavier than the money bags at our feet. Vincent stared straight ahead, his hands relaxed on the wheel as if he were driving to church. I knew then that the cartel wouldn't be the only thing coming for us. We had crossed a border that night that wasn't marked on any map. My dreams of a luxury life were replaced by images of the driver's face. We reached a safe house in Laredo just as the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. Vincent began divvying up the cash, throwing bundles at us like he was feeding dogs. The other 2 crew members took their share and vanished into the morning mist without a word. I stayed behind, watching Vincent count his portion over and over again. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with an encrypted message that turned his triumphant grin into a mask of pure fury. The vibration of the encrypted message felt like an electric shock against my palm. I stared at the grainy image of our getaway driver, Rico, slumped in a chair with his eyes wide in terror. Behind him, a tall silhouette stood partially obscured by the thick shadows of the basement. I recognized the signature chrome-plated .45 tucked into the man's waistband. My breath hitched as I realized Vincent wasn't just hiding from the cartel, he was hunting us. I threw my meager belongings into a duffel bag and checked the hallway through the peephole. Every shadow in the parking lot seemed to morph into the shape of a man waiting with a blade. I drove for 3 hours straight, heading toward a safe house in the desert outskirts of El Paso. The radio crackled with static, occasionally picking up snippets of frantic Spanish transmissions. I thought about the families of the witnesses Vincent had executed in Mexico and felt a wave of nausea. He had enjoyed the killing, his eyes turning into empty black voids as he pulled the trigger. I reached the safe house, a low-slung cinder-block structure hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the dry morning breeze. I drew my weapon and stepped inside, the smell of copper and bleach hitting me instantly. In the kitchen, another one of our associates was zip-tied to a radiator, his throat sliced clean. Vincent was erasing the evidence of the heist by eliminating everyone who knew his face. He wasn't just a criminal anymore, he had evolved into a ghost, a predator with no loyalty. I found a small digital recorder on the kitchen table, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. I pressed play and Vincent's calm, melodic voice filled the silent room. "You were always the smart one," the recording whispered through the tiny speaker. "But even the smartest mouse eventually finds the trap," the voice continued with a low chuckle. I realized the recorder wasn't just a message, it was a distraction. A floorboard creaked in the room behind me, heavy and deliberate. I dove through the kitchen window just as a spray of bullets shattered the glass above my head. I landed hard in the dirt, rolling behind a rusted-out car frame for cover. Through the gaps in the rusted metal, I saw Vincent emerge from the house, moving with predatory grace. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was participating in a sport he had already won. My gun was back in the kitchen, lost during my desperate escape through the window. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon or a distraction. Vincent whistled a cheerful tune that echoed off the surrounding canyon walls. I crawled through the tall yellow grass, trying to reach the tree line without being spotted. A bullet kicked up a plume of dust inches from my face. The sound of the suppressed shot a mere thwip. "I can see your trail, partner," Vincent called out with chilling friendliness. I reached a cluster of rocks and found an old, abandoned well hidden by boards. I slid into the dark, damp hole just as Vincent reached the rocky outcrop. I held my breath, pressed against the cold stone walls, listening to his footsteps above. The silence stretched for minutes, broken only by the sound of my own thudding heart. Then the wooden boards were slid back into place, plunging me into complete blackness. I heard the faint sound of a padlock clicking shut on the surface. "Sleep well, friend," Vincent's voice echoed down the shaft, sounding miles away. As his footsteps faded, I realized I wasn't alone in the dark. Something cold and wet brushed against my ankle. I froze as the cold, wet sensation on my ankle registered through my skin. It was only a broken pipe, weeping rusty water onto the concrete floor of my hiding spot. The ghosts of Vincent and my crew felt miles away, yet the air in Austin still tasted like smoke. That smell always takes me back to December of 1991, a night that changed the city forever. North Lamar Boulevard was quiet that Friday night, save for the hum of the holiday traffic. The neon sign of the "I Can't Believe It's" yogurt shop buzzed with a steady, rhythmic hum. Inside, 4 teenage girls were finishing their shifts, dreaming of the weekend ahead. But the shadows outside the glass were moving closer as the clock ticked toward midnight. I remember seeing a man standing by the payphone, watching the door with predatory focus. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like a hunter waiting for the trap to spring. Suddenly, the shop's lights flickered and then went completely dark. A plume of thick, black smoke began to curl from the roof vents into the cold night air. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the interior was a raging inferno of melting plastic and screams. The firefighters didn't just find a fire, they found a scene of absolute depravity. In the back room, 4 young bodies were discovered, bound and executed with chilling precision. The fire had been set to cover the tracks of a monster who walked among us. Investigators combed through the debris for weeks, finding almost nothing in the scorched remains. The killers had been efficient, vanishing into the Texas night like ghosts. Years passed and the case grew cold, leaving a wound in the heart of Austin that wouldn't heal. Then, in 1999, a break finally came when 4 men were arrested for the crime. But the confessions felt forced, as if they were reading from a script written by tired detectives. The physical evidence didn't match the stories they were telling under the pressure of the lights. One suspect claimed he was miles away, yet his DNA was nowhere to be found at the scene. Public outcry for justice was deafening, pushing the legal system to its breaking point. I sat in the courtroom, watching the families of the victims as they clutched photos of their daughters. In a stunning turn of events, the convictions were eventually overturned due to lack of evidence. This meant the real killers were still out there, perhaps even watching the news that day. I began to see shadows everywhere, wondering if the man from the payphone was still nearby. Decades later, a new lead emerged from a piece of clothing recovered from the fire. Advances in DNA extraction allowed scientists to find a genetic profile that didn't belong to the suspects. The profile belonged to an unknown male, a ghost who had been at the crime scene. This ghost left behind a trail of terror that spanned across the state lines of Texas. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a ritual of violence for someone who enjoyed the chaos. The families were left in a limbo of grief, neither seeing justice nor finding peace. I often think about that night and the choices that led everyone to that shop. The evil that visited Austin in 1991 didn't just disappear, it evolved. Just last week I received an anonymous letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photo of the yogurt shop before the fire. On the back, written in shaky, familiar ink, were the words, "I saw you watching." My blood ran cold as I heard the slow, rhythmic creak of a floorboard right behind my chair. I froze as the floorboard creaked, but when I turned, only the flickering shadows of the television greeted me. For decades, that same phantom noise had haunted the residents of Austin, a city scarred by an unsolved evil. The year 2008 brought a massive upheaval when the convictions of the original 4 suspects were suddenly overturned. It was a blow to the community to realize that after 17 years, we were back at the very beginning. DNA analysis had become the new frontier, yet the samples from the crime scene remained a mystery. The state pushed for retrials, but the lack of physical evidence against the young men made justice feel like a sliding scale. Then a violent encounter in another part of the state reignited the public's fear. Maurice Pierce, once a prime suspect, was killed after stabbing a police officer during a routine stop. His death left us wondering if the killer had finally met his end, or if we were chasing ghosts. 11 more years passed in a state of stagnant grief as the 90s faded into memory. In December 2021, a new task force announced they were reopening the case with technology the world hadn't seen in 1991. Investigators utilized genetic genealogy to build a family tree from the unknown male DNA found on the victims. The trail led them to a name that had been whispers in the dark for years. Robert Brashers was a serial offender who had committed his crimes across multiple states. He was a man who had escaped the long arm of the law by ending his own life years earlier. In 1999, Brashers died during a violent shootout with police in Kennett, Missouri. The Austin police traveled to Missouri to retrieve the weapon used in that final standoff. Ballistics experts fired the weapon, comparing the new casings to the ones kept in Austin since 1991. Every microscopic scratch and groove matched perfectly, confirming the identity of the killer. In September 2025, the announcement was made public, bringing a definitive end to the mystery. We finally had a face to put to the evil that had plagued our nights for 34 years. Knowing he was already dead meant there would be no trial, no sentencing, and no chance for the families to look him in the eye. Yet the closure was real, providing a heavy weight being lifted from the city's shoulders. The families of Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Amy could finally breathe, knowing the truth was out. The boys who had spent years in prison for a crime they didn't commit began the long process of seeking restitution. Under Texas law, their innocence entitled them to significant compensation for every year lost behind bars. No amount of money could truly repay the decades of life stolen by a flawed investigation. The shadows of the Lone Star State are long, and they hold secrets that take generations to uncover. I walked back inside and locked my door, not out of fear, but out of a new sense of peace. The story of the yogurt shop murders serves as a reminder that the truth always waits in the light. We remember the girls not for how they died, but for the light they brought into the world. Austin is a different place now, a city that has grown and learned from its darkest winter. The justice we found was delayed, but it was justice nonetheless. As a community, we can finally turn the page on this horrific chapter of our history. The ghosts of the past have finally been laid to rest beneath the Texas soil. Modern science has ensured that even the most calculated evils can no longer hide forever. We carry their names forward, ensuring their stories are told with dignity and truth. The wind whisks across the plains, carrying away the echoes of the screams that once filled the night. A new day begins in Texas, bright and untainted by the terrors of the past. Rest easy now, for the truth has set us all free.